Welcome aboard the interstellar starship Genesis. Together, we'll journey beyond the boundaries of known space, explore distant worlds, and witness the quiet wonders of the universe. If you enjoy relaxing sci-fi sleep stories like this, please consider liking this video and subscribing to join us on future voyages. Now find a comfortable place to rest. Take a slow, gentle breath, and whenever you're ready, let the journey begin. Chapter 1. Arrival. 12 years ago, Genesis detected the first undeniable evidence that humanity was not alone. A distant structure, so immense that even across light years, its geometry could not be mistaken for anything nature had created. We changed course immediately. For the past 12 years, every kilometer we traveled brought us here. Today, we arrived. For a long moment, no one spoke. The structure filled the forward observation window so completely that it was difficult to understand what we were seeing. There was no horizon, no beginning, no obvious end. Great arcs disappeared into darkness before emerging again farther away. Entire sections caught the light of a distant star while others remained hidden in shadow. It was impossible to see all of it at once. Our eyes searched instinctively for something familiar and found nothing. Every image we had reconstructed over the previous 12 years, every simulation, every scientific model had underestimated its presence. Not its size, its presence. There is a profound difference between studying something and standing before it. For the first time in human history, another civilization was no longer an idea. It was outside our window. The observation lounge remained unusually quiet. No applause, no celebration, only the occasional sound of someone taking an unsteady breath. I think each of us understood, without needing to say it, that this was one of those rare moments history would remember forever. Genesis continued its final approach exactly as planned. Weeks earlier, we had begun reducing our relative velocity. Now the ship moved with extraordinary patience. Every adjustment was measured, every correction deliberate. There was no reason to hurry. We had already crossed the impossible distance. A few more hours would change nothing. While the ship continued forward, the science teams quietly began the work they had prepared for years. Every instrument turned toward the structure. Optical telescopes resolved details no reconstruction had ever captured. Spectrometers examined the composition of its surface. Radio receivers listened across the electromagnetic spectrum. Thermal imaging searched for evidence of energy use. Nothing about the procedure was rushed. Discovery begins with observation, not assumption. The question of communication had been discussed for years, not because we believed we had arrived unnoticed. Quite the opposite. Any civilization capable of engineering a structure of this magnitude would almost certainly have detected Genesis long before we came close enough to observe it ourselves. Our first transmission would reveal nothing. It would simply acknowledge that we had arrived. The message itself had been prepared long ago. It contained no spoken language, no images, no references to Earth. Only ideas any scientific civilization should recognize. Prime numbers, the hydrogen spectral line, fundamental constants of physics, a declaration that intelligence had crossed the darkness between the stars, seeking understanding. Nothing more, nothing less. At precisely the scheduled time, Genesis transmitted humanity's first greeting to another civilization. No one expected an immediate reply. Signals require time. Understanding requires even more. Still, as the transmission disappeared into the silence ahead, every person aboard found themselves watching the structure, waiting, hoping, wondering what would happen next. The universe had finally answered one question. We were not alone. Now, it was our turn to wait for an answer. Chapter 2. First Observations. Our first transmission continued outward at the speed of light. Whether anyone would hear it was no longer a question we could answer, so we turned our attention to what we could. Observation. Genesis continued closing the remaining distance with extraordinary care. Every passing minute revealed details that had been impossible to resolve from afar. The structure was not a single object, it was many. Great rings surrounded enormous central frameworks. Long bridges connected sections built on a scale unlike anything humanity had imagined. Some rotated, others remained perfectly still. Nothing appeared random. Everything belonged exactly where it was. The first discovery came from the engineering team. One of the larger rings completed a full rotation every 92 seconds. The number immediately caught everyone's attention, not because it was unusual, but because it was familiar. At that radius, the rotation produced almost exactly one Earth gravity. Whoever had built this place had solved the same problem we had aboard Genesis. Life is remarkably difficult in weightlessness. Even civilizations separated by light years must still obey the same laws of physics. For the first time, another civilization felt just a little less alien. The second discovery arrived only minutes later. Construction marks, not written language, engineering. Different sections had clearly been manufactured using different techniques. Some appeared older, others were unmistakably newer. The structure had not been completed all at once. It had grown, expanded, adapted, much like the oldest cities humanity had ever built. Generation after generation had left their work beside those who came before. It was an oddly comforting realization. We were looking at history, not simply architecture. As optical resolution improved, another detail emerged. There were windows, thousands of them, perhaps millions. Some overlooked open space. Others faced inward toward rotating habitats. For the first time, it became possible to imagine people living there, looking outward, watching the stars, perhaps wondering if they too were alone. The thought lingered only briefly. Science demanded evidence, so Genesis continued observing. Radio receivers remained silent. Spectrometers detected nothing unexpected. Thermal maps slowly expanded across the structure. Every instrument quietly added another piece to the picture. No one rushed to conclusions. We'd only just arrived. Then another report appeared, one worth reading twice. Large radiator arrays extended far into space, exactly where they should have been. Their temperatures matched our models almost perfectly, which meant the structure was still rejecting heat. Somewhere inside, energy was still being used. That realization spread quickly through the ship. The structure wasn't frozen. It wasn't drifting lifelessly through space. Its systems were still operating. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to keep something alive. Or, at least, to keep something running. Excitement returned almost instantly. Perhaps they had detected us. Perhaps they were watching. Perhaps they simply needed time. No one found those possibilities unreasonable. After all, we had spent 12 years reaching them. Waiting another few hours for a reply hardly seemed significant. Genesis transmitted the greeting again. The message was identical, carefully measured, patient, respectful. It disappeared into the darkness between us, just as the first one had. Then we continued watching, because for the first time, it no longer felt like we were studying a structure. It felt as though the structure might be studying us. Chapter 3. The Quiet Between Us. Genesis continued its careful approach, and with every passing hour the structure revealed another piece of itself. From a distance it had seemed impossibly large. Now we realized something even more remarkable. It had never been designed to be seen all at once. No matter where our cameras looked, another section extended beyond the edge of the frame. Great rotating habitats disappeared behind immense support structures before emerging again several kilometers away. Long trusses connected rings, towers, and enormous open frameworks with an elegance that spoke of careful engineering rather than excess. Whoever designed this place had built it for the people who lived here, not for distant observers like us. The first detailed measurements began arriving from the engineering team. Several of the rotating habitats maintained an angular velocity that produced almost exactly 1 Earth gravity along their inner surfaces. The number immediately caught everyone's attention. Different civilization, different history, yet they had arrived at exactly the same physical solution. Gravity had mattered to them just as much as it mattered to us. For the first time since our arrival, the builders of this place felt less like strangers and more like fellow engineers solving the same impossible problems. Other discoveries followed naturally. Sections of the structure clearly belonged to different periods of construction. Some materials showed manufacturing techniques, unlike neighboring sections, while connecting corridors revealed that new habitats had been added long after older ones were completed. This was not a structure built in a single generation. It had evolved. Just as cities on Earth slowly expand over centuries, this place had grown alongside the civilization that called it home. The observation teams continued gathering information while Genesis repeated its greeting at carefully planned intervals. Nobody expected an immediate reply. If humanity suddenly detected another civilization arriving at Earth, our own response would not be measured in minutes. It would require discussion, verification, and extraordinary caution. We assumed they would think much the same way, so we watched, and we waited. As our instruments became more precise, another pattern quietly emerged. The enormous radiator arrays continued rejecting heat into space exactly as physics predicted they should. Rotating habitats maintained stable speeds. Orientation thrusters made occasional microscopic corrections to preserve the structure's attitude. Everything we observed suggested active systems, not abandoned machinery, not a drifting relic, a functioning piece of engineering. That realization created an unexpected sense of optimism throughout Genesis. If the structure was still maintaining itself, perhaps the civilization that built it still lived somewhere inside. Perhaps they had already seen us. Perhaps they were simply choosing patience over haste, just as we were. No one considered those possibilities unrealistic. In fact, they seemed the most reasonable explanations we had. Then one of the navigation officers asked for a broader survey of the surrounding space. The request seemed almost routine. If this was an inhabited structure, there should be movement beyond its walls. Cargo traffic, maintenance vehicles, small transport craft traveling between different sections. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet activity that accompanies everyday life. The survey expanded farther and farther from the structure. Every returning image showed the same breathtaking architecture, the same stars, the same empty space. No approaching traffic, no departing vessels, no construction activity. Nothing moved except Genesis itself. No one suggested an explanation. There was still far too little evidence. Perhaps we had approached through a rarely used region. Perhaps their transportation network operated entirely within the structure itself. Perhaps their technology simply looked nothing like our own. Every possibility remained open. Genesis transmitted another greeting. Once again, we turned our attention toward the structure, still expecting an answer, still believing one would eventually come. But for the first time since our arrival, we found ourselves watching the empty space around it, just as carefully as we watched the structure itself. Chapter 4, Built to Endure. By the time Genesis entered the outer boundary of the structure, our attention had begun to shift. The question was no longer simply whether another civilization still lived here. We'd spent hours looking for evidence of activity. Now, we found ourselves asking a different question. Why had they built this place at all? The answer was not immediately obvious. At first glance, the structure resembled a city. It possessed enormous rotating habitats, capable of supporting vast populations. Transportation corridors connected distant sections. Power systems remained active. Every observation suggested a place designed for life. Yet the farther we looked, the less that explanation satisfied us. One of the navigation specialists quietly pointed out something none of us had considered. This was an unusual place to build a civilization. There was no nearby planet, no obvious source of raw materials, no dense system of asteroids waiting to be mined. Even the local star lay far enough away that collecting energy required engineering on a remarkable scale. If efficiency alone had guided the builders, they could have chosen far better locations. The observation sparked a discussion that quickly spread through the science teams. Every civilization makes compromises, sometimes for safety, sometimes for resources, sometimes for reasons that only make sense within their own culture. Perhaps this location had offered something more valuable than convenience. Astronomers began studying the surrounding region rather than the structure itself. The answer appeared slowly. The archive, or whatever this place truly was, occupied an unusually stable region of space. There were no nearby gravitational disturbances, no close stellar encounters expected for millions of years. The surrounding environment was astonishingly quiet. If someone wanted to build something that could survive for an exceptionally long time, they would struggle to find a better location. That realization changed the conversation aboard Genesis. For the first time, we stopped asking how the structure had survived. Instead, we began asking whether survival had always been its purpose. The engineering teams returned to the images with fresh eyes. Features that had seemed merely impressive began to look intentional. Redundant power pathways, independent rotating habitats, distributed control systems. entire sections capable of operating without the others. It was an architecture built to tolerate failure, not years of failure, perhaps centuries. Human engineers had always designed important systems with redundancy. Spacecraft carried backup computers, backup communications, backup life support. This structure followed the same philosophy, only on a scale that dwarfed anything humanity had ever imagined. It was not fragile. It had been designed to outlast the civilization that built it. Whether they had intended that, we still could not say. Genesis transmitted another greeting. The message remained unchanged, patient, respectful, universal. No reply came, yet strangely, the silence no longer occupied our thoughts as completely as before. A different possibility had begun taking shape. Perhaps this place was never meant to be merely inhabited. Perhaps it had been meant to remain. I looked once more through the observation window. The structure no longer reminded me of a city. Cities change. They grow. They disappear. This felt different, deliberate, permanent, as though someone had built it with a quiet hope that long after they were gone, someone else would eventually find it. Chapter 5. The Measure of Time. Until now, every observation had described where we were. Now, the science teams turned their attention to a different question. When? Distance tells us where an object exists. Time tells us its story. Every structure carries a history within its materials, whether it was built on Earth or among the stars. The challenge is learning how to read it. Space has no rain to erode a surface, no wind to smooth its edges. Instead, time leaves quieter signatures, tiny impacts from micrometeorites, constant exposure to high-energy radiation, subtle chemical changes caused by millions of years in the vacuum of space. Individually, those changes reveal very little. Together, they become a remarkably reliable record of time. Although Genesis remained too distant to collect physical samples, our instruments could examine the structure in extraordinary detail. Spectrometers analyzed exposed materials. Polarimetric imaging measured changes in reflective surfaces. High-resolution cameras searched for patterns of microscopic erosion. Each team worked independently. Each used different assumptions. No one wanted the answer influenced by another group's expectations. The first estimates arrived quietly, then a second set, then a third. None of them agreed perfectly. That was expected. Scientific measurements rarely do. What mattered was something else. Every result pointed in the same direction. One of the analysts requested the calculations be repeated from the beginning. No shortcuts, no previous data, a completely independent review. The request was met without hesitation. Extraordinary conclusions deserve extraordinary verification. Hours passed as models were rebuilt and measurements checked once again. When the revised results appeared, they had changed surprisingly little. Different methods, different researchers, the same answer, again and again. The oldest portions of the structure had not been exposed for years, nor for decades. They'd endured the space environment for centuries. Other sections were unmistakably newer, added long after the original construction. Then, at some point, the expansion had ceased. No recent additions could be identified anywhere we had observed. No one spoke for several moments, not because the conclusion was dramatic, but because it was difficult to argue with. Every independent measurement had arrived at essentially the same place. whatever history the structure carried, it had not unfolded recently. The discovery did not tell us what had happened. It did not tell us whether the builders had moved elsewhere. It did not tell us whether this place had become a monument, a research facility, or something we had not yet imagined. Good science does not invent answers to questions it cannot yet solve. It simply narrows the possibilities. Genesis transmitted another greeting. The signal crossed the remaining distance exactly as every previous transmission had. Patient, measured, respectful. Still, nothing returned. I looked once more toward the immense structure beyond the observation window. It no longer felt like something waiting to welcome visitors. It felt like something that had been waiting for a very long time. Not for us, simply for whoever might come next. Chapter 6. Built to last. By the second day, our attention had shifted once again. The question was no longer who had built the structure, or even when. Those answers, though incomplete, were beginning to take shape. Instead, we found ourselves asking something far more practical. How had it survived? Every spacecraft humanity had ever launched required constant attention. Components wore out, electronics failed, moving parts eventually reached the limits of their design. Even aboard Genesis, maintenance had become part of daily life. Nothing built by intelligent hands lasted forever. At least, that had always been our experience. The structure challenged that assumption. The more closely we examined it, the more difficult it became to understand why it still functioned so well. Rotating habitats remained remarkably stable. Power distribution continued across enormous distances. Thermal systems still balanced heat exactly as physics demanded. Nothing suggested a machine struggling to remain alive. Instead, it behaved like a system carrying out the work it had been designed to do. The engineering teams began looking beyond the obvious. Rather than asking what the structure did, they began asking how it responded to failure. That was where the answers started to appear. Critical systems were never isolated. Power could be rerouted through multiple independent pathways. Control networks appeared widely distributed rather than concentrated in one location. Entire sections seemed capable of functioning, even if neighboring sections became completely inoperative. Redundancy existed everywhere we looked. The philosophy felt strangely familiar. Every important spacecraft humanity had ever built relied upon redundancy. Life support had backups. Navigation had backups. Communications had backups. Failure was never eliminated. It was anticipated. The builders of this structure had embraced exactly the same principle, only on a scale we had never imagined possible. Another observation followed. The oldest portions of the structure did not appear fundamentally different from the newer ones. Interfaces remained compatible. Connections aligned perfectly. Replacement seemed to have been considered from the very beginning. Individual sections could be renewed without redesigning the whole. It was an elegant solution to an ancient engineering problem. How do you preserve something while allowing it to change? One comment from the engineering team stayed with me. Cities are rarely finished. They expand, they adapt, they rebuild themselves continuously. This structure had clearly done the same. Yet at some point, those changes had stopped. Not abruptly, not through visible catastrophe, simply they had stopped. No one attempted to explain why. The evidence did not allow it. Perhaps the builders had moved elsewhere. Perhaps this had become only one part of something larger. Perhaps the answer waited somewhere inside the structure itself. There were still far more questions than conclusions. Genesis transmitted another greeting. As before, the message carried only mathematics and the language of physics. If anyone remained to receive it, they would understand that another intelligent species had arrived with curiosity rather than fear. The structure answered exactly as it had every time before. It continued doing what it had always done. Nothing more, nothing less. As I watched the immense framework drift slowly past the observation window, one realization became impossible to ignore. Whatever this place had once been, its survival was no accident. Someone had expected time to matter, and they had built accordingly. Chapter 7. The First Invitation. By the third day, our observations had reached a point of diminishing returns. Every new image improved our understanding of the structure. Every new scan refined our measurements. Yet none answered the questions that had brought us across the stars. Those answers, if they still existed, were somewhere inside. Before Genesis could approach any closer, navigation began the careful task of identifying a safe insertion path. The structure was simply too vast to improvise. Every kilometer contained rotating habitats, immense support members, and open frameworks moving with extraordinary precision. Our approach would have to respect the motion of the entire structure. The first indication appeared almost by accident. One of the navigation officers noticed a repeating signal buried within the background noise. It was faint, exceptionally stable, and unlike anything we had transmitted. At first, it was dismissed as an instrumental artifact. Signals have a habit of appearing where none exist, especially when scientists hope to find them. The observation was repeated using independent receivers. The signal remained. Different instruments, different software, the same result. It originated from the structure itself, not from a rotating habitat, not from one particular section, but from a region extending outward from one of the largest external openings we had yet observed. The signal carried no language, no images, no mathematical greeting. Its rhythm was remarkably simple: steady timing, consistent intervals, precise directional characteristics. The more we studied it, the less it resembled communication, and the more it resembled navigation. Modern airports guide aircraft long before pilots can see a runway. Harbors use lights and markers to lead ships safely through narrow channels. Spacecraft rely on navigation beacons during rendezvous and docking. Different technologies, the same purpose: helping travelers arrive safely. No one claimed that was what we had found. The evidence did not yet allow such certainty. But when the signal was compared against the geometry of the surrounding structure, something remarkable appeared. Every projected approach aligned with the same enormous opening, one specifically designed to accommodate vessels entering from interstellar space. The room grew unusually quiet, not because we believed the beacon had awakened for us. Quite the opposite. The simplest explanation was that it had never stopped operating. It had continued broadcasting, hour after hour, year after year, perhaps for centuries, doing exactly what it had always been designed to do. The engineering teams immediately began checking the approach, relative velocities, rotation rates, clearances. Every calculation reached the same conclusion. If Genesis followed the guidance implied by the beacon, our arrival would require remarkably little correction. Whoever had designed this system understood orbital mechanics with extraordinary precision. Their solution was unfamiliar. Its mathematics were not. For the first time since reaching the structure, our path forward no longer depended solely upon our own observations. Another civilization's engineering, still functioning after all this time, had quietly shown us the safest way in. Genesis adjusted its trajectory by less than a single degree. The maneuver was almost imperceptible, yet it marked the final change of course in a journey that had begun 12 years earlier. No speeches followed, no celebrations, only quiet concentration as humanity committed itself to an approach designed by minds that had lived beneath another sky. As the structure slowly filled more of the observation window, one thought remained impossible to ignore. Whatever had happened here, the builders had expected ships to arrive, and somewhere ahead, their engineering was still waiting to receive them. Chapter 8. Crossing the Threshold. Genesis continued along the approach corridor, following the ancient navigation beacon exactly as it had been designed to do. Nothing about the signal changed. Its timing remained perfectly regular. Its strength remained constant. It neither acknowledged our presence nor guided our decisions. It simply continued broadcasting the same quiet reference it had transmitted for longer than anyone aboard Genesis could imagine. With every passing kilometer, the entrance grew larger. From a distance, it had appeared to be little more than an opening in the structure. Now its true scale became impossible to ignore. The corridor stretched deep into the interior, its walls extending for kilometers before gradually disappearing into darkness. Genesis, the largest spacecraft humanity had ever built, looked almost insignificant against it. For the first time since leaving Earth, our ship no longer felt immense. It felt like a visitor. The engineering was unmistakable. Nothing had been carved for appearance alone. Every surface carried purpose. Structural members transferred unimaginable loads. Navigation markers remained fixed to the rotating reference frame. Access corridors disappeared into the surrounding framework before branching in every direction. Even without understanding the civilization that had built it, we understood their engineering. Good design needs no translation. Genesis slowed once again. The final approach demanded patience rather than precision alone. Relative motion between ship and structure had been reduced to almost nothing. From the observation lounge, it became difficult to believe we were still moving. Only the slowly changing perspective along the corridor reminded us that the journey continued. As our floodlights reached deeper into the entrance, new details quietly emerged. The interior surfaces showed remarkably little evidence of damage. Micrometeorite impacts were surprisingly rare. Critical structural members remained perfectly aligned. Nothing suggested hurried repairs. Nothing suggested neglect. It simply appeared maintained, not recently, but extraordinarily well. Nobody rushed to explain what we were seeing. Perhaps autonomous systems still carried out routine maintenance. Perhaps the structure had simply been over-engineered to such an extent that centuries had changed. Very little. Perhaps the answer waited farther inside. For now, the observations mattered more than the explanations. The docking team completed its final calculations. There would be no dramatic maneuver, no last-second corrections. Genesis had been following the same carefully verified approach for hours. Now the ship drifted forward almost effortlessly, guided only by its own navigation and the quiet mathematics of orbital mechanics. Beyond the entrance, the darkness slowly gave way to light, not bright illumination, just enough to reveal that the corridor continued far beyond reach of our instruments. More intersections appeared, more passages, more destinations than we could possibly explore. For the first time, the structure no longer felt like a single place. It felt like a world. No movement greeted us. No vessels passed overhead. No transmissions interrupted the silence. Only the steady beacon behind us and the immense corridor stretching ahead. The absence of activity no longer felt temporary. It simply became another characteristic of the place itself. One more observation, one more fact. Genesis crossed the entrance without ceremony. No doors opened, no systems awakened. Nothing announced our arrival. The structure remained exactly as we had found it. Ancient, patient, indifferent to the passage of time. For the first time in human history, humanity passed beyond the boundary of another civilization. Whatever answers awaited us, they were no longer beyond our reach. They were somewhere ahead. Chapter 9. The First Steps. The final approach ended without ceremony. There were no welcoming lights, no transmissions, no movement from the structure around us. Genesis simply drifted into its assigned position, following a navigation system that had continued its quiet work for centuries. When the docking clamps engaged, they did so with barely enough force to be felt. The journey was over. For several minutes, no one moved. Not because we were uncertain, because every person aboard understood the significance of what came next. Humanity had crossed the darkness between the stars. Now, for the first time, we would leave our own ship and step into another civilization. Protocol remained unchanged. Exploration begins with caution, not excitement. Small inspection drones crossed the docking interface first, carrying environmental sensors, structural scanners, and radiation monitors. Their task was simple: confirm what our instruments already suggested. Nothing more. The first reports arrived quickly. The docking corridor remained in hard vacuum. Radiation levels were unremarkable. The surrounding structure showed no signs of instability. No unexpected energy sources appeared. No biological hazards were detected. The drones continued only far enough to confirm that the immediate area presented no obvious danger. Then they returned. The rest would belong to us. Preparation aboard Genesis unfolded with the same quiet discipline that had guided every stage of the mission. Pressure suits were inspected one final time. Communication systems verified. Life support reserves confirmed. Every procedure had been rehearsed countless times during the journey. Yet today, even the familiar routine felt different. Training had finally become history. The airlock cycled slowly. Mechanical locks disengaged one after another. Pressure fell to vacuum. Indicator lights changed from red to green. No one spoke. There was nothing left to discuss. The outer hatch opened. Beyond it, another civilization waited in perfect silence. The first step was almost disappointingly ordinary. A boot crossed the threshold. Magnetic soles locked gently against the deck. then another, and another. Within seconds, humanity stood somewhere no member of our species had ever stood before. Not on another planet, not aboard another spacecraft, but inside something imagined, designed, and built by entirely different minds. The corridor stretched away in both directions. Its proportions felt familiar enough to navigate comfortably, yet every detail reminded us we were visitors. The walls carried subtle patterns formed by methods of construction we did not recognize. Lighting remained soft and remarkably even, revealing only what was necessary. The floor beneath our feet showed no dust, no debris, and no signs of collapse. It felt less like entering a ruin and more like entering a building that had simply been left undisturbed for an extraordinarily long time. No one rushed ahead. Every observation was recorded, every measurement confirmed, every step taken deliberately. Curiosity had brought us across the stars. Discipline would carry us the rest of the way. As we continued deeper into the corridor, I found myself looking not at the engineering, but at the space between it. The width of the passage, the placement of handrails, the gentle curve where two corridors joined. None of those choices had been made by nature. Someone had imagined people moving through these spaces every day. Someone had thought about comfort, about safety, about the ordinary routines of life. For the first time since arriving, the structure no longer felt like an extraordinary piece of engineering. It felt like a place where ordinary lives had once been lived. And somehow, that made it feel more remarkable than ever. Chapter 10. The First Page. The corridor eventually opened into a chamber unlike any we had encountered before. It was neither industrial nor residential. No machinery dominated the room. No transport routes passed through it. Everything about the chamber suggested that visitors had once been expected. The space was immense. Its ceiling disappeared into darkness high above us, supported by graceful arches that seemed almost impossibly light for their size. Wide pathways converged toward a circular platform at the center of the room. Around it stood hundreds of tall structures, arranged with deliberate symmetry. They were neither sculptures nor machines, at least not in any way we immediately understood. Our light swept slowly across their surfaces. Each one was remarkably well preserved. No signs of impact, no structural failures, no hurried repairs, only the quiet confidence of engineering built to endure. For centuries, perhaps longer, the chamber had remained remarkably unchanged. The science teams resisted the understandable urge to touch anything. Every measurement came first. Spectral analysis, radiation surveys, high-resolution imaging. The chamber offered no indication of danger, nor did it immediately reveal its purpose. It simply invited careful observation. Then, one of the researchers noticed something. The same geometric relationships we had seen throughout the structure appeared again here. Not once, hundreds of times. Circles, ratios, prime number sequences. The repetition was unmistakable. This was not decoration, it was organization. One of the freestanding structures stood slightly apart from the others. Its surface reflected our lights differently, revealing an almost seamless panel stretching from floor to ceiling. As one of the scientists stepped closer, the panel slowly brightened. No sound accompanied it. No sudden movement. Only a gentle glow spreading across its surface. Not because it recognized us, because it detected presence, a system quietly performing the task for which it had been engineered. Simple patterns appeared: a circle, a line, another circle, then a sequence of prime numbers. No language, no symbols we could mistake for words, only mathematics, the same universal foundation upon which humanity had built its own first greeting. A quiet smile spread across the room, not because we understood what we were seeing, but because we understood where it began. The display continued. Hydrogen, atomic transitions, fundamental constants, relationships between time, distance, and light. Each idea built naturally upon the last. It did not feel like a message. It felt like an introduction, patient, methodical, designed for strangers who shared nothing except the universe itself. We'd found something even more remarkable. Whoever built this place had begun with the assumption that one day another civilization would stand where we now stood. Not necessarily us, simply someone. I looked around the chamber once more. For days we had searched for the builders themselves. Instead, we had found the beginning of a conversation, one they had started centuries ago, one we were only just learning how to continue. Outside, Genesis rested quietly within the ancient structure. Beyond it, the stars continued their slow journey across the darkness. The voyage from Earth was over. Another journey, one measured not in distance, but in understanding, had just begun. Humanity had crossed the stars hoping to answer one question. Were we alone? Standing inside that silent chamber, we finally knew the answer. Tomorrow, we would begin asking the next one. Our journey comes to an end. For now, thank you for traveling aboard the interstellar starship Genesis. If you'd like to continue exploring the stars with us, please consider subscribing for future voyages. Until we meet again, sleep well and safe travels.